Hi, I'm Joe Spencer-Bennett. I'm a member of the Department of English Language and Linguistics at the University of Birmingham. This talk I'm going to give now is about political language, and it's about a particular idea about what makes for good political language, what makes for good, specifically for good political English. And that idea says that good political language, good political English is ordinary vernacular English. It's what George Orwell called demotic speech. In fact, writing in his diaries in June 1940, just under a year into the First World War, Orwell complained about the lack of demotic language he saw in the government communications around him. He wrote, "There is still nothing in really demotic speech, nothing that will move the poorer working class or even be quite certainly intelligible. Most educated people," and he means they're the people who design political language, the civil servants, the propagandists, "don't realise how little impression abstract words make on the average man." The idea that there's something politically valuable in ordinary, demotic, vernacular ways of speaking was something that's really comes across very strongly in Orwell's work, in his essays after this diary entry, and in his novel 1984 to some extent. But it definitely wasn't his alone. In fact, at the same time that Orwell was complaining about this political language, this lack of demotic speech in government communications, there was an organisation called Mass Observation who were working with the Ministry of Information to promote what they called a language of leadership. They wanted the government communications to be more vernacular, just as Orwell did. And they produced materials, for example, listing words that the government should use in propaganda and words that they shouldn't use in propaganda. Words that, as they put it, the words that you shouldn't use were words that, as they put it, might be suitable in Whitehall but unsuitable in Whitechapel. And the idea here was that there were some things that the government simply shouldn't say because they didn't reach a mass audience. In fact, one of the very famous posters from the Second World War, alongside the Keep Calm and Carry On poster, which was produced at the same time, read, "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory." Mass Observation and many other people at the time criticised this poster because they said the government really shouldn't be using long words, long abstract words like resolution, if they wanted to reach this mass audience. This demotic speech ideal was particularly prominent during the Second World War. It's a particularly intense time of thought about the use of ordinary language in politics and especially in propaganda. But if we jump forward to much more recent history, here's what one of the most recent round of, in fact the very last round of Brexit MEPs, Martin Daubney, had to say about his surprising electoral success for the Brexit Party in the 2019 European parliamentary elections. He said, "For my entire career as a coal miner's son from Nottingham, I've been able to speak with ordinary people. I understand the language of the man and the woman in the street, and that's what I think has been the difference with our campaign." There are many years and many other things celebrating Orwell and Daubney, but this is an idea that you see brought out to explain the electoral success or the rhetorical success of a really diverse set of political figures, from Tony Blair, who was seen as being an ordinary communicator in many ways, to a very different figure like in the United States, Donald Trump. The idea has been that part of their reason for their success is because they are able to sound ordinary, they're able to sound vernacular, they're able to use what Orwell would have called demotic speech. So these have only been a few examples, and they're clearly far apart in history, and they're only suggestive. But what I think they're suggestive of is this intense emphasis on demotic speech in thinking especially about British politics, not just about British politics, but thinking especially about British political rhetoric. For me, this raises a few questions though, and I'm going to, in the rest of this talk, go through these questions, and there are three of them. The first is, if there's been this kind of emphasis on the uses of demotic speech, does that mean that the language has actually changed? Does that mean that we see changes in political language over, say, the second half of the 20th century towards a more demotic style in politics? The second question is, it's talked up by people like Orwell and people like Daubney, but does it really work? Speaking in vernacular ways, is that really in any way more, to put it in simple terms, is that really more persuasive or more successful? And then finally, and this is a question that's particularly interesting to me, as someone who works in the Department of English Language and Linguistics, as a linguist, what is it that really people mean when they talk about ordinary English or demotic speech? What kind of language is this? When Daubeny talks about the man and the woman on the street, what kind of man, what kind of woman, what kind of street, what kind of things are they saying? So I'll now go through each of those questions in turn. The first one was, to what extent has the actual language of political communicators changed? And there are a few studies that we can use to kind of help inform an answer to this question. It's only a partial answer, but I think we can start to put one together. So about 15 years ago now, a linguist, Michael Pearce, published a study of party election broadcasts, the television, short television clips that political parties produce in the run-up to elections. Michael Pearce took a set of features that we know to be more common in spoken English, and he took another set of features that we know to be more common in written English. And he measured the relative frequency of those two sets of features over time in these party election broadcasts. So for example, when we're speaking, we use more personal pronouns than when we're writing. I, me, you, things like that. When we're writing, we tend to use, and there's a tendency, longer words than we do when we're speaking. And what Pearce found is, sure enough, over the late 20th century, with a few wobbles along the way, things got a bit more spoken. So these party election broadcasts came across as slightly less scripted, more spontaneous, more spoken, more informal. In another study by Judy Atkins and Alan Finlayson, who are political scientists, they looked at party conference speeches. And they looked at the kind of cultural allusions and anecdotes and quotations that the political speakers used in their speeches. And they compared the frequency of two different things. They compared sort of high cultural allusions, mentions of Shakespeare or quotations from the Bible, and they compared those to everyday anecdotes. I met someone in the street and they told me this. And they found that the high cultural allusions fell away over time, again with a few wobbles, and the kind of everyday anecdotes increased. Now both of these studies suggest, and there are two studies of two very different kinds of political language, and there's obviously much more to it than that, but they suggest a shift towards the informal over time. What's problematic about this, and what's often difficult, is even if we do establish a language change, so the language seems to become more like speech, or it seems to become more informal over time, it's very difficult to match that with what we know about people's attitudes towards language. The language might be changing, but what counts as formal and what counts as informal, that also might be changing. What counts as a formal use of language in 1945 might not be the same as what counts as a formal use of language in 1995. A good example of this is with accents. So we know, for example, that received pronunciation, what sometimes used to be called BBC spoken English, is associated with formality, it's associated with prestige, it's associated with poshness, but what counts as received pronunciation over time has changed and shifted. A good example of this is a sketch by Monty Python from the 1970s. This was a sketch that was released as a small 7-inch record that came free with a magazine, and it was called Teach Yourself Heath. And it was basically the Monty Python comedians making fun of Ted Heath's accent. Ted Heath was from Kent and a grammar school boy, and had slight evidence of a non-RP Kent, non-received pronunciation Kent accent. But listening to that record now, when I play that to students now, they don't hear that at all. They hear an old posh man. So the joke's clearly faded over time, if it was ever particularly strong in the 70s. So assuming there has been this shift in political language towards the more informal, the second question is, well, does this work? Does using more demotic forms of speech, does it work? Does it work to persuade people? Does it work to win over audiences? That's quite a simplistic question, and I think it's also quite a problematic one to answer. If we assume there has been a general shift towards the more informal over time, then it doesn't seem to mean that we like our politicians any more than we used to, or that they come across any better than they used to. Studies by organisations like Ipsos Mori and the Hansard Society certainly don't show that we like or trust our political leaders any more than we used to, even if they are talking in slightly more informal ways than they once were. A few years ago, I conducted a study where I collected a set of correspondence from the Mass Observation Project from the 1980s. I mentioned Mass Observation earlier as an organisation that helped design the propaganda during the Second World War. But by this time, by the 1980s, it had shifted its emphasis and did kind of social research associated with the University of Sussex. And they collected correspondence on all kinds of matters from people all around the UK. And the particular correspondence I was looking at was about the aspect of everyday communication, the kind of rules and nuances of everyday life that basically most annoyed people. And this was from the late 80s. And the thing that seemed to come across as the most annoying thing, and people's opinions obviously varied, but the thing that came as sort of the top of the pile of annoying things for people in 1980s Britain was inappropriately informal language. Correspondents really didn't like things like people using their first name, strangers using their first name, even doctors, things like this, using their first name, or things like "have a nice day," which at the time were seen as Americanisms. So it seemed to be disliked, often quite viscerally, seen as inappropriate, socially inappropriate, rude, sometimes even intrusive. So there's a suggestion that perhaps sometimes we don't really like being spoken to in these informal ways. Other researchers have suggested that despite the awkwardness that we sometimes feel with informality from people in positions of power, it is an expectation that we have. We want our political leaders to be ordinary, and this is a thing that's sort of changed over time. So a few years ago, a group of political scientists published a book called The Good Politician, in which they tracked public expectations of politicians, public images of what makes a good politician over time. And they found that between the mid and the late 20th century, an expectation of ordinariness came to the fore. In the mid 20th century, the British public maybe didn't expect ordinariness from their politicians. By the end of the century, they did. But this is something that they note with a kind of a point that they make with a note of regret, not because they're concerned about the dumbing down of politics or anything like that, but because they saw ordinariness as a very, very difficult thing for politicians to achieve. It's not easy to be ordinary. The conversation analyst Harvey Sachs, or a conversation analyst, is a sociologist who's interested in the workings of everyday conversation as a way into kind of looking at the social organisation of everyday life. He talked in the 1970s about the way in which ordinariness was not a thing that you have. Some people just are ordinary, but a thing that you do. It takes work to be ordinary. It's a kind of act that we do to be ordinary. And also the way in which it's a circumstantial thing. Being an ordinary prisoner is very different from being an ordinary university lecturer, for example. We can do all these things in ordinary ways. And what we might take from the Good Politician study and from Sachs's work is that the idea that being an ordinary politician and being an ordinary person at the same time, speaking in ways that are politically ordinary and just plain ordinary, is a very difficult thing to achieve. The authors of the Good Politician study suggest that it might ultimately be setting all political leaders up for a fall. They can't. It's an unattainable thing, something that's impossible to achieve. So the third question I asked was about what we might mean by demotic speech, what kinds of language this might even mean in the first place. I've begun to give a bit of an answer to this question, some of the things I've already said. Most of what I've been talking about has been about informality and formality. Now, when we look back at what Daubeny said and what Orwell said, and I talked about it at the beginning of this talk, Daubeny talks about being a coal miner's son, and he talks about the man and the woman in the street. And we intuitively know when we hear that he doesn't mean Mayfair, he doesn't mean Park Lane. That's not the streets that he has in mind. There's a well-known and very close and intertwined relationship between ideas about formality and informality in language and ideas about social status and social class. And this comes through even more explicitly in the quotation from Orwell in Orwell's diary entry, where he talks about the poorer working class, the language of the poorer working class. So demotic speech seems to be not only an attempt to be more informal, but also to reach an audience that maybe is seen as being especially far from Whitehall or from the centres of political power. I think an interesting point here is to bear in mind that whenever we use language, we are speaking to a real audience. I'm speaking now to some real people. But for me, the person doing the talking, you are very much an imagined audience. And this is true of all audiences that we address. Even if we know someone quite well, we don't know everything about them. We don't know how they're going to react to every single thing we say. So we talk to them in an important respect as an imagined audience. And this is especially true if we are a political leader speaking to millions of people. There's an important way in which we have to imagine that audience, which means we have to imagine what kind of language might appeal to that audience. And here, I think, in the demotic speech ideal, we see an overlap between this idea of developing political communications and something that linguists often call language ideologies. It's an idea about how language works, about how particular groups of people speak, about what kinds of language might appeal to what kinds of people. It's an interesting one because at the time that, say, Orwell was writing, it kind of struck out against conservative ideas about language. So Orwell was placing great emphasis on the value of vernacular forms of English at a time when certainly non-vernacular forms of English, things like RP, BBC English, were seen as being prestigious. And Orwell and many other people, many other proponents of the demotic speech ideal, say that there's something valuable in ordinary English. They see it as being valuable often for quite particular purposes, for communicating with a mass audience. But they also, in seeing it as being valuable, have to imagine it in particular ways. They have to imagine what ordinary English is like, what working class English is like, the kinds of things that the man on the woman and the woman on the street actually say. Politicians have, of course, over the years put a lot of work into trying to find out about that. So in the Second World War, mass observation would go around and do things like eavesdrop on conversations on buses or on street corners. We have things like focus groups and opinion polling and things like this. Tony Benn in the 1960s, when he was an MP in Bristol, decided to board the buses and ride the buses with people on their way to work in the morning and talk to them in an attempt to try to find out how ordinary people spoke and, of course, how ordinary people thought about things. But there's always an active imagination that's involved in this, and there's always an attempt to try to work out what this ordinary English is that is being so valued. And what I think we sometimes see is, and in some of the examples I've given so far, is that it's often, certainly in the work of Orwell, it's often defined in terms of absences. So things that you can't say, things that if you're a political leader, it might be okay to say in Whitehall or in your party offices, but you can't really say that out on the street, and you can't really expect that to come across to a mass audience, these unsuitable words. Often those things are seen as being abstract things that we might think are really important for politics, but that can't be, according to this conception, can't be got across to this kind of mass audience that's imagined as also as a working class audience. Another thing that sometimes comes across in this talk is a certain kind of association of demotic speech with sentimentality or irrationality. So, for example, one of the final publications of an office called the Central Office of Information, which was what the Ministry of Information eventually became, and which was closed down quite recently by the coalition government in around 2010. One of their final publications was about the value of local accents, and they said local accents might be really good in publicity campaigns for changing people's behaviour because of this credibility and everydayness that they associate with local accents. But if you want to lay down the law and tell people what to do, then you better use RP. So there's a sense in which local accents, vernacular forms of English have their particular place. They're important in political communications. But they also come with all these sets of associations, ideas about people and the way in which they use language, what kinds of things might appeal to them, which, while they value vernacular forms of English, also reduce it, limit its scope to these particular areas. So what I think has made the demotic speech ideal so appealing, and I think it has been appealing, and I think it is intuitively felt by many people who are responsible for the design of political communications, many political leaders, many people who write speeches or comment on political language in the media, is that it seems to recognise something really important about the society in which we live, which is that that's an unequal society, stratified in many ways. People use language in various different ways, and that's part of that stratification. But it seems to see that inequality, see that stratification as largely being a communicative problem, not a problem to do with material inequality or to do with differential access to power or resources, but a problem for those in positions of power, a problem that says we want to reach this audience, but we find it difficult to do so. And then I think, interestingly, it sees the very resources to overcome that problem in that stratification itself. It says, well, there are these ordinary ways of speaking. Ordinary people speak in these ways. there are these everyday informal ways of using language. So why don't we use those? Those will help us to overcome this problem. So it reimagines this societal problem, which I think is a real problem, which it really does recognise. People like Orwell certainly recognise this, and imagines it as a communicative problem, as a kind of discursive or linguistic problem. And I think also the reason that maybe we remain a little bit sceptical about this, even if we do kind of want politicians to seem ordinary, the reason I think it makes us feel uncomfortable when we hear a politician too readily use first names for audience members, or shift maybe a little bit too far in their accent in a way that feels awkward. I think the reason we feel uncomfortable about that is because we see that this is as a solution to this problem that really leaves the fundamentals of the problem untouched. That it's the inequalities are recognised by the demotic speech ideal, by those who would speak in more vernacular ways. But the fundamental facts, the facts of inequality, the facts that we might feel quite distant from the centres of political power, aren't really changed by this in any way. So it seems like it's a solution to the problem that ultimately has very little to say about the fundamentals of the problem itself.